Accessible is an adjective. Accessible. Capable of being easily obtained. Accessible. Easily used or accessed means accessible. I've got a question. How accessible are you to be used for God's purposes? How accessible is your family? How accessible is your marriage to be used by God? Oftentimes, being accessible means God has access to you even when you did not anticipate it or plan it. God has access to your resources. God has access to your time even when you did not plan for it to happen. You say, Pastor, I believe I'm accessible to God. I believe my marriage, I believe my family is accessible to God. Let me give you a little brief accessibility quiz. Just answer it in the kind of the quiet of your own minds. For instance, you and your family are planning, as soon as church is over, to maybe go home to a nice meal that's in the crock pot, or maybe stop off and eat a meal somewhere you like on the way home. And you're going to get home and throw on your shorts and your oversized t-shirt and take a nap. And you're just thinking about that nap. It's just a Sunday afternoon nap, right? Nothing quite like that. And as you're leaving church, you notice there's a young lady standing by the door. You could tell she's been crying. You don't recognize her. She's a guest. And you know if you stop and talk, it's probably going to require some time. So you feel like, okay, I need to stop. And you stop and you begin to speak to her and find out there's some things going on in her life that are going to take far more than just a couple of minutes. And for you to minister to her and your family to minister to her, it's going to basically wipe out your entire afternoon nap, maybe even the meal the way you had planned it, and things would have to change. And I'm just wondering, how accessible are you to a situation like that? You come to church, you've got your offering, you've got it maybe in the envelope, or maybe you already gave online like a lot of our people do. You've already given electronically. Your regular weekly, your regular monthly offering. And you show up at church and the pastor begins to share with you a great need that has arisen. Some ministry need that's going to take some funding, and he's asking for a special offering. Not advance notice, just kind of on the spur of the moment. Something came up, and in the service he offers an opportunity for you to give. But for you to do that, you've already given your regular offering, but for you to give now, you're going to have to eliminate something else this month that you normally do, that you normally like, that you normally prefer. It's going to take some other area out of your budget, out of your resources. How accessible is your wallet to a situation like that? Accessible time, your accessible resources. A new couple begins to attend Green Acres Baptist, or a new person begins to attend Green Acres Baptist Church. That happens often. And you have a regular group of people you kind of feel comfortable with, that you sit with, that you talk with, you get together with. Maybe you're a youth, maybe you're a senior adult, but you have the people you're comfortable with at Green Acres Baptist Church. That's typical, that's normal. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong with that. We have certain people that we tend to be closer to, and we fellowship with them, we get together with them. But this new couple, this new person, these new people began to attend Green Acres Baptist Church. And for you to be able to minister to them, you may need to go out of your way, taking you away from the people you're more comfortable with, just to minister to that person or those people in their situation, or just for the fellowship. How accessible are you to get out of your comfort zone and enter into that kind of a relationship? Folks, I'm just saying, I could give you 10 more of these. But whether it's time, whether it's resources, whether it's relationships, how accessible are you? How accessible is your family? How accessible is your marriage to be used by God? Green Acres Baptist Church has a mission statement. Under the lordship of Christ and by His power, the mission of Green Acres Baptist Church is to passionately worship Him, win the lost to Him, and equip every believer to be a disciple of Him. That is our mission as a church. But sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be good for our couples, our families, to sit down and put themselves in that mission statement. Under the lordship of Christ and by His power, the mission of Johnny and Alyssa Ellison is to passionately worship Him, win the lost to Him, and equip every believer to be a disciple of Him. Or put in your family's last name in that mission statement. This is the accessibility that God desires for any marriage, any person, any family. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about building a marriage that is accessible to God. A marriage that is accessible to God. Acts 18. Acts 18 is where we will be. We continue our walk through the book of Acts. Now, some of you may be saying, "Oh, Pastor, I'm not married." Well, maybe one day you will be. And here are some thoughts that you may want to consider the kind of marriage you want to our young people. If you want a marriage that honors God, maybe you'll see some things in here you want to make sure are in place if you're entering into marriage. You say, "Pastor, I don't plan on ever getting married again." Well, then maybe you can draw some of these things and help some of those along the way who are younger than you to say, these are the things that you want to be a part of your marriage. We're going to be looking at a couple, which is why I'm discussing marriage in particular, because it is a married couple that we're going to learn about today and their story, at least the parts of it that we know. Paul is in his second missionary journey. He has been working his way down through the region of Macedonia. And as he works southward, he's been to Philippi, he's been to Thessalonica, he's been to Berea, he's been to Athens, and now in the far southern tip, in a region called Achaia, is the city of Corinth. And as he shows up in Corinth, he meets a couple who we've already talked about in weeks past, but a couple who I want to kind of re-engage, if you will. And as he develops a relationship with this couple, and as we read of their story, there are a few thoughts I think we can learn about building a marriage that is accessible to God. Listen to this. This is our primary theme for the day. Our marriages are the most effective when they are the most accessible to whatever God might want to do whenever He wants to do it. That's when our marriages are most successful. And that thought is on the screen right now. That is when our marriages are most successful, when they are the most accessible to God. What are some of those traits that I think reflect an accessibility to God? Acts chapter 18, we're going to look at verses 1 through 3, and then we'll skip forward into verse 18 and all the way down into verse 26. Maybe we might hit 28, all the way to 28, but you kind of get the picture. As we walk through this passage, this is not an exhaustive list on what a marriage should contain. What it is looking at a couple whose lives were used by God and gleaning some truths from them. And I want to say something and be very clear about it. God's design for marriage has never changed since the day He established it in the garden in Genesis chapter 1. God's original and best design is one man and one woman for life. That's His design. If I believe the Scriptures are true, that is one of those things I must believe because it is so prevalent in the Scriptures. Now, I realize we live in a world with brokenness and sin and death, and maybe a spouse has passed away, maybe something happened years ago in a marriage that crumbled. I get those things happen. I got that. And I know that God, in His great, great graciousness, also offers us opportunities to be restored and move on and serve Him. But I also know that just because the culture is radically changing to the degree that there are conversations now on whether marriage really is a valid entity anymore anyway. I'm telling you, it has not changed. And I'll tell you this, from personal experience of 27 years, if God's involved in it, it just keeps getting better. I can tell you that from experience. So let's take a look at some of the ideas that we can glean from an accessible marriage. Verse 1, beginning in chapter 18 of the book of Acts and verse 1. After these things, that is, the things that happened in Athens, Paul preached to a group of unbelievers, and then he moved on down into Corinth. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. Now, we've looked a lot at Corinth in past weeks, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but just suffice it to say, Corinth was an intimidating city. It was a city that was on a very important trade route, north and south and east and west. It was a city that had a lot of money and a lot of poverty. It was a city that had a lot of depravity, like many large cities do. It had a large temple dedicated to a goddess, part of whose worship involved temple prostitutes, and those prostitutes would ply their trade down in Corinth. And it was just an ungodly city, a big city, an intimidating city, even to the Apostle Paul. So as he arrived there, verse 2, he found a certain Jew named Aquila, whose name means eagle. Aquila and his wife, Aquila was born in Pontus, and he had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Italy, Rome. They had come from Rome. And parenthetically, verse 2, I talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but I want to kind of re-engage this phrase. That when they were in Rome, Claudius, the emperor, had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. That is, Paul came to Priscilla and Aquila. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And so something that I pointed out a couple of weeks ago that I want to kind of rediscuss here, if you will. Priscilla and Aquila had made their home in the city of Rome. That was their home place. That's where they had established their roots. And the emperor, the government came along and said, "You can't live here anymore. We do not want you to live in this city." They were citizens. They were established. They had friends and relationships and people they knew. They had contributed to the society. And yet the government said, "You can't stay here." Why did the government tell them they couldn't stay here? Stay there? Purely because of their race and their religion. Simply because of their race, they were Jews, and their religion, they were Jews. They were not allowed to stay in Rome anymore. If someone came to your door from the government of Warner Robins or Georgia or the federal government for that matter, if they came to your door tomorrow, let's just say it's the state government, "We want you to leave Georgia. You cannot stay in Georgia anymore. I was born in Georgia. I've lived in Georgia. I've got a house here. I've got family. I've got friends. What do you mean I can't stay in Georgia anymore? You will not be allowed to live in Georgia anymore. We'll give you a week to get out. And if you're not gone, we will put you in prison." But why? Simply because of your race, simply because of your religion. Now you tell me, how would you feel picking up and leaving? What kind of hurt? What kind of fear? What kind of bitterness and anger would you have to battle? What kind of offense would be on your heart? And yet we read here of a couple living in Corinth who are trucking on and ministering to the Lord in spite of the fact they had faced immense heartache and heartbreak. Let me suggest to you something, folks. A marriage that is accessible to God will be a marriage that ministers successfully in the face of heartache. You show me a marriage that's accessible to God. You show me a marriage where that the couple's literally, God, whatever you want to do with us, we are prepared. It is a marriage that will successfully continue to minister even when you face heartache, even when you face trial, even when you face heartbreak. In fact, many of you can testify to this truth. A big part of a successful marriage is facing and persevering through difficult times, heartbreak, and unforeseen challenges. Listen, I'm convinced that a lot of the heartache and heartbreak and trials Alyssa and I have faced are part of the glue that's made us stronger through the years. And you show me a marriage that is accessible to God, and I'll show you a marriage that can face heartache. Nobody wants to. I'll show you a marriage that's facing trials, valleys, difficulties. Nobody wants to face those things. But I'll show you a marriage that faces those things and comes out on the other side still ministering successfully. These unforeseen trials. But here's why. Because a marriage that is accessible to God, when it's faced a trial, it comes out on the other side, it's in better shape than it was before it went in. Trials grow us. Trials help us to find out who we are. Last week, many of you know I was out, I was gone. J.J. Washington preached. He did a great job. I don't know how many of you were here last week, but he did a great job. And that video is not up on the website yet, but I want to get it up there so those of you who weren't here might be able to see. He did a great job. Anyway, so Alyssa and I and Sarah Elizabeth, Andrew was in from college for just a few days for fall break. And so we traveled north up to Clarksville, Tennessee, which is where our oldest and her husband live, Savannah and Caleb. He is on the baseball staff at Austin Peay University. And so they've just moved there. They moved 3 times in 3 years, so I almost forget where to go when we go visit them. They move so often, it seems like. That's kind of part of, when you first get into college coaching, it's kind of part of the deal. Anyway, so we went up to see them, drove up Friday, got up Saturday morning, and Caleb's team had a doubleheader, kind of a fall baseball scrimmage, and we wanted to go see that. So Alyssa and I and Savannah got up Saturday morning and decided to go for a run in a park that was there in Clarksville. It's a nice park. Clarksville, by the way, is the 5th largest city in Tennessee. After Memphis and Knoxville and Nashville and Chattanooga is Clarksville. Anyway, so we went out and we parked by this playground. And Alyssa and Savannah and I, we got out of the car and we were stretching out. And Savannah said, I figured we would just start this way. And I don't remember if I said it or I thought it. I think I may have said it something like, well, this must be a loop. You know, a lot of parks will have these loops, the jogging, walking trails, and there'll be a loop and you come back around. I said, well, it's probably a loop. So we took off running and we said, well, we'll just run 2 or 3 miles today on Saturday, and then Sunday afternoon before we go back home, maybe we can catch another 2 or 3 miles. And so we took off, running down the path, and we're, trucking along, just chit-chatting as much as we can. Savannah is capable of talking much more than either Alyssa or I, because I'm just trying to, breathe. So we get on down the path, and we go past a couple of miles, but I see a 2-mile marker. I said, I wonder if this is kind of the midpoint. Maybe it's a 4 or 5 mile loop. You can go around. Yeah, probably so. Well, we get to 4.8 miles, and we're thinking, this doesn't really look like it's looping. So we see a lady walking her dog. She appears to be someone who's probably there a lot, and I asked her, I said, ma'am, can you tell us where this trail goes? Does it loop around? She said, oh, no. It dead ends. You just go to the end and turn around and go back the way you came. I cannot begin to explain to you how disheartening that was. And I thought several things in the moment. I thought, what happens if I just sit down here and don't move? I mean, will somebody come get me? We had left our cell phones in the car, so we didn't have any way of contacting someone and letting them know where we were. And very quickly I came to the conclusion, we're going to have to turn around and go back the same way we came. So those who are pretty decent at math, we turn around and go all the way back. By the time we're done, it's 9.6 miles. Now, for some of you, maybe there's some runners, maybe there's some folks here, that's not a big deal. For us, it was a big deal. It's a funny thing, though. One thing I know, when it was all said and done, is physically and mentally and emotionally challenging as that distance was. I'll have to admit, on the way back, we kind of walked and ran a lot. There was maybe less running than walking. But anyway, so I got back, and I thought, here's the one thing I know. Alyssa and I have been talking about wanting to train for a half marathon. Well, that was our first training session right there. And here's another thing I knew. Once I got back, once I got over the soreness of my feet for the next 2 days, my body was probably in better shape than it had been before I started that run, because it just makes you better. I got to tell you something, folks. Walking through trials together in a marriage that is accessible to God, you come out on the other side and you're stronger than you were before you went in. But I see it all the time. I see marriages that face trials and they just come apart. And here's what I knew about that marriage. Before it went into the trial, it was not a marriage accessible to God. Because a marriage where God can easily come in and use it is a marriage when it walks through trials, when it walks through heartache, when it walks through challenges you did not anticipate. Like a 9.6 mile run you thought was going to be 2 miles. You get out on the other side, and a marriage that is accessible to God, we're stronger than when we started. Ministering successfully in the face of heartache is one characteristic of a marriage that is accessible to God. Now, we're going to leap forward in the book of Acts, all the way to verse 18. Paul has finished up his ministry in Corinth of 18 months. Okay, so he spent 18 months in Corinth. So verses 1 through 17 cover about an 18-month period. And we pick up in verse 18. It says, "So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria. And Priscilla and Aquila were with him." Which is intriguing. Of course, they had left Rome. They had established their home place in Corinth. And now as Paul leaves, they're going with him. Remember, Priscilla and Aquila and Paul had made tents together, and he had preached the gospel, and they had ministered together. And apparently, watch this, apparently they had built such a strong ministry relationship that it was decided they would kind of travel with him for the time being. We know that later on they aren't with him, but for now they are. And so it says, he sailed for Syria. Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. If you want to reference what probably this vow was, we won't go there, but Numbers 6, 1 through 7 speaks of this type of vow where the hair grows, probably a Nazirite type vow. And so notice this, Paul does not require Gentiles to be Jews to be Christians, but Paul is still being a Jew. So it was very important because Gentiles are not required to become Jews, to become Christians. That was established back in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council. That they become born again and they begin to serve the Lord. But if you're a Jew, if you like, it's perfectly acceptable for you to continue to be that, even as you're a Christian, as long as you don't think any of those ceremonial practices lend or add to your salvation, because they don't. And so Paul had this vow that he had taken, and so he finished it up. Verse 19, "And he came to Ephesus and left them there." Them being who? Priscilla and Aquila. He left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. We're going to see later, in a few moments, how God used Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus later on. But watch this. One of the things you see here about Priscilla and Aquila is that they are maintaining a healthy ministry relationship. And that is, I believe, important for any marriage that will be accessible to God, is that there are ministry relationships we maintain, both for our well-being and for the well-being of those with whom we're friends. that we might be exhorters to them, they might be exhorters to us. If you're looking toward marriage or looking ahead and you're a young person, one of the things you want to find important as you're coming together in a marriage relationship is knowing there are other relationships out there with people, those people who will build you up and you build them up. Now look, I know that usually when we think about a ministry relationship, we think about someone who is in the same place in life as we are, the same age, we have the same age kids, and those are great. In fact, if you want that, I highly recommend a Sunday school class. If you're not already plugged into a Sunday school class, that's a great way to connect with people who are maybe at the same place in life as you, or some of the same experiences. But there is a more important purpose in building these ministry relationships than just being with people who are at the same place in life as you. The importance is a spiritual purpose. It's not just primarily about common life events. For instance, Paul is, I believe, an older single man at this point, and he develops this close relationship with this couple. We don't really know how old Priscilla and Aquila are, but we know they show up 20 or 25 years later in the New Testament. So I'm going to assume that they're maybe a little younger. So this younger married couple develops this close friendship with this older single man who's a preacher. Now, how much different could they be? How much more distinct could these two be? And yet they built this relationship. Here's my point. Befriending those who are in the same place of life as you can be very good, but it is not required every time. If you have that friendship with another couple or person who is at the same place in life as you, that's great. But more importantly, the friendships and relationships with people who spur you on spiritually are more critical. And that could mean a young couple develops a friendship with a couple 40 years their senior. That could be an older single man develops a relationship with a young couple. That could mean all kinds of different life experiences together, but we come together in relationships because we're doing ministry together. By the way, I see that happen time and time again in the church. I see it happen because people come together, and let's just say maybe they get involved on a grow team. Well, on a grow team, you could have someone older, younger, middle-aged, you could have married, you could have single. And they begin to minister there, and they develop this relationship together that helps both of them. Maybe you get involved in some other area of ministry, serving in various ways. And because you're serving there, because you're involved there, you just kind of connect with people who normally you probably wouldn't get together with them because you don't have many life experiences that are similar. But because you minister together, you develop these relationships that is part of the church. So let me suggest to you that maintaining healthy ministry relationships is a part of a marriage that I believe is accessible to God. And then skip forward one more time. Paul leaves Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, right? Skip to verse 24. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. We're not going to talk a lot about Apollos because I'm going to come back to this passage and talk about Apollos in more detail. But I want to talk about Priscilla and Aquila in this particular thing. It's amazing, the text of Scripture, just the depths of it, the different angles you can take on a particular text, and there's so much there to it. So it says Apollos comes to Ephesus. Priscilla and Aquila were left by Paul in Ephesus, right? Verse 25. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord. In being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. This is a unique situation. He's teaching the Scriptures. He knows only the baptism of John, which is a baptism of repentance. And so he's teaching everything he knows and doing it effectively. And so verse 26, so he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. For he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, knowing from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. Look at what Priscilla and Aquila did. They're in Ephesus. Guy shows up, powerful teacher, knows the gospel except not all of it, and he begins to preach powerfully, and they're blown away by his skills. And so, as a loving couple who love the Lord, they pull this young man aside and sit down and explain to him, can you imagine the knowledge they had just to pour into Apollos? And could they have possibly known the impact that Apollos was going to make? 2,000 years later, we're talking about them, and we're still talking about Apollos. Many people think Apollos wrote the book of Hebrews. Nobody really knows who wrote the book of Hebrews. But it is not all out of the question to believe that Apollos wrote it. Many people do. And can you imagine that? A guy that didn't have kind of all of it together, but this ministry couple who are just trucking along, see this young man, they just begin to pour into him. Who knows what could happen if you use your marriage to pour into other people? Who knows what could happen if you take someone alongside and begin to pour into them? So watch this. Another characteristic of a marriage accessible to God is when it moves ahead in ministry opportunities. This marriage just continues to find opportunities to minister. And by the way, that's not all. Write these down. We'll not turn there, but write these down. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 19. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 19. A decade after Acts 18, right? A decade after the events of Acts 18 that we just read about. Everybody got that? In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul writes and mentions Priscilla and Aquila who are in Ephesus. Still, 10 years later, they're ministering in Ephesus. And then Romans chapter 16, verses 3 through 5. This is now going to be about 11, 12, 13 years after the events of Acts 18. In the book of Romans chapter 16, Paul wrote that, many believe Paul wrote the letter to the Romans from Corinth. He once again mentions Priscilla and Aquila and mentions their house church. But no one really knows where it is. Watch this. 2 Timothy 4:19. You ready? 2 Timothy is Paul's last letter. He's an old man. He's about to die. 2 Timothy was written some 20 years after the events of Acts 18. 20 years. And 20 years later, he mentions Priscilla and Aquila. And you know what he mentions about them? He mentions their house church in Rome. Those dudes went back to Rome. They finally made it back there. But it wasn't going back there about proving a point. Some of us would say, I ain't going back there. The way they treated me, I ain't never going back there. But Priscilla and Aquila were more concerned about taking the gospel back into Rome. All the other stuff did not matter to them. They were a couple who were looking at opportunities to move ahead into ministry. And what if we saw our marriages? And my marriage is about the Great Commission. What if we saw our marriages that way? My marriage, its whole purpose is to expand the kingdom of God. That's why marriage exists. What if we saw our marriages that way? Because that is the way God sees them. That's why He wants two believers, man and a woman, coming together, loving Him, loving one another, and being used to extend the kingdom. Our marriages are the most effective when they are the most accessible to whatever God might want to do whenever He wants to do it. This book is a book off my shelf. It has some of that Golda Meir writing is rubbed off. You can't even see the title anymore. It's called Abandoned to God. And it is the biography of Oswald Chambers. How many of you sitting here today have a copy of My Utmost for His Highest? I highly recommend it. A lot of hands went up. It is the largest selling devotional book in the history of the Christian church. No comparison. My Utmost for His Highest. Some of you think when you read My Utmost for His Highest that you're reading a book that Oswald Chambers wrote. Well, not exactly. There are a couple of chapters in this book that talk specifically about Oswald's wife, Gertrude Hobbs Chambers. He called her Biddy, affectionately. I don't know that that's an affectionate name you want to call your wife now, but he did, and she liked it. Gertrude Hobbs was the longtime wife of Oswald Chambers. Oswald Chambers died when he was 47 years old, never having written a single book of any kind. Then how did his books get written? Gertrude Chambers, Biddy, was one of the foremost dictation experts in England. She could do shorthand. I don't even know I don't think shorthand's taught anywhere anymore, because now you can just do voice to text. But she could dictate 250 words a minute, faster than anybody could talk, even me. And so when they got married, Oswald Chambers took over the YMCA station in Egypt during World War I. And he had this big tent, and several times a week he would teach hundreds and hundreds of soldiers from all over about the gospel, about Jesus, about the grace of God, about the Christ life. And Biddy would sit at the back. And they had a little girl, and the little girl was at the time was just newborn, would sit her right beside her, and she would take dictation of all of his messages, all of them. And she kept those in books. And when he died, she did not want to see his messages die, so she began to write those out longhand. And she wrote out a number of them, and there were some people who got a hold of some of her writing and decided they wanted to publish it. One of the things that got published was My Utmost for His Highest, among other books of his. Any book you see of his was his teaching, her dictation, and her writing. How much more of a ministry marriage can you get put together than that? Anybody here has a copy of My Utmost for His Highest? Really, you're reading Biddy Chambers' writing, Oswald Chambers' teaching. See, marriages that are accessible to God will walk through trials successfully. We'll find opportunities for ministry. Every marriage doesn't need to look the same. I'm not saying every marriage is going to create My Utmost for His Highest. In fact, the vast majority won't. You know, the vast majority of marriages may just teach a children's Sunday school class, or serve in a local church, or minister to neighbors, or help some folks in a nursing home. Things that nobody will ever know about, things that nobody will ever see, will never be written about, no movies will ever be made about them. But what happens if we all begin to look at our current marriage, or maybe our future marriage, as an opportunity for the Great Commission, a marriage accessible to God? Now, if you're here today and you've never trusted Christ as your Savior, I'm telling you, if you want a marriage accessible to God, it is going to start there. It starts with two born-again people coming together, loving God, loving each other. That's where it begins. You can't do anything else till that happens. And if today's your day, say, Pastor, I want to know how to trust Christ as my Savior, today would be a great day to come forward during this invitation time. Or maybe you'd just like to come and pray together as a couple. Or maybe there's someone you'd like to pray for. Maybe someone you know who is married, that you want to pray for them, or someone you know who's going to get married and you want to pray for them. I'm telling you, folks, what if it... Or maybe you want to come and pray and say, Lord, I'm praying for marriages at Green Acres Baptist Church. Maybe you're not even married, but you want to pray, Lord, I pray for marriages at Green Acres Baptist Church, that they would be accessible and used by you. Families, households would be used by you. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to stand, and you respond as the Lord leads. Father, right now, in Jesus' name, help us to obey you as you lead us. Father, right now, you stand right where you are.